It is good to be back, and I wanted to tell you, you're all winners. You're all winners of a bread and breakfast trip to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. So if you get there, transportation's not included, but lodging and food is. So if you get there, we'd be happy to take you on a boat ride, Lake Tenkiller. The trees are we're usually a little bit behind, so the trees are just going to be changing here in the next 2 weeks to 3 weeks. We're in the foot of the Ozarks, so it has its own set of beauty there. So you're all winners and welcome. Karen and I always love to come back, but we feel that we're changing just a little bit because we thought how chilly it was in the morning when the days started, and we thought, wow, it's like it's below 40 degrees, and it seems to be having an effect now. So. But we are glad to be back. I called Mel when I had to come up for some other issues and said, I know you're without a pastor right now. I don't want to intrude. If it would be helpful, I'd be happy and always love to bring the message. And so she graciously gave me the opportunity. So I appreciate that. Last weekend, I was in Texarkana. Have you ever been to Texarkana? What do you think of Texarkana? Just like another place, right? So I was in Texarkana. A doctor there invited me to come down and speak at his practice to help train his staff. So last Saturday, I was actually in Heritage Church because his staff is so large that he rents a church auditorium for me to speak at because he has 8 practices and he can't put them all in one location, so he rents the Heritage Church for his day of staff training. So I was there to introduce the concept of how to care for your patients and a little training on history and taking history. And I stayed in his home. It's beautiful. Multi-million-dollar home, 8 practices, a staff of over 100 people. He has his own lab where he creates glasses for all of these. And he always treats me great. He really does. Treats me great, pays me well, offers me a job every time I go there. And I said, my wife said I can't go any further south than I am now because she can't take the winters. So I turned him down, and I am very, very happy for his success. But I always walk away when I shut the door of my car and drive back to Tahlequah. I always feel just a little bit small because I look at that huge practice and that beautiful house and that staff that fills an auditorium, and I think to myself, same education, and my practices were little like this compared to his. And I teach in the smallest college of optometry in the country, in a building built in 1920, and every time it rains, it leaks. And I have to have 2 buckets there by my office to keep things. And I'm thinking the dilapidated old building, and I walked away, and I always feel just a little bit small, a little bit insignificant. Do you ever feel that way? Just a little bit small, a little bit insignificant. And then the week before that, Karen and I had the opportunity to go to Richmond, Virginia. I was speaking on a new technique there to the docs, and then we decided to take a little extra time and go to Virginia Beach. So we went out to Virginia Beach, and there seems to be so common anymore, there was a hurricane, again developing, way offshore, and so they said, well, the beach is probably going to be closing here in a day or so. So people were vacating around the beach. It was very quiet, but a Midwestern boy like me, I'm not going to go to the ocean and not get my toes wet, right? I mean, that's just part of the deal, because I don't get to see the ocean on a real regular basis. So regardless of the fact that they might be closing the beach, I had to go, and before they did, and get in the water. So I walked in, I got my toes wet, and I thought, I got to go out further, and I got to go out further, and pretty soon the waves were huge compared to what I thought about, and I couldn't see past, and I would stand there and wait for the wave to come in. And the wave would inevitably roll me around and knock me down and take me back to the beach. So I thought, well, I better get out a little bit further and see what happens. And then the wave would come in and it would just take me completely back. I didn't have the strength to stand there as the waves rolled in. And pretty soon I thought, this might be dangerous if I keep getting further and further out, because, I don't know how this all works with coming to the beach, and there's an undertow that takes you further out, and nobody else is around because everybody else thinks there's too much wind and it's too cold. And so as I was walking back in, I stopped and I turned around and I looked out into the horizon again. And all I could see at that time was water. There weren't any boats. There was only water. And then the waves that drove, and sometimes the wave would get high enough you'd have trouble seeing the horizon, you just see the wave as it got closer. And as I was staring at that wave that seemed to get bigger and bigger, I wondered again if God really cared. If I was too small in all of that vastness, if I was too small and too insignificant to be bothered with. The same hand that created that magnificent, awesome wave, does it really care about me? Does it really care about you? And I thought about 12 men who were out in a much more difficult scenario centuries before. And they weren't looking at the waves at Virginia Beach. They were, I believe, in the Sea of Galilee. And they were out in a storm. And without our modern abilities, like when I was at Virginia Beach, they knew exactly how far away the hurricane was and what time it was going to hit the beach. And without all of that information, these 12 men were out on the Sea of Galilee. You remember the story. And the storm came up suddenly. And it was ferocious. It was fast. And the boat began to capsize just a little bit. And my guess is they were bailing and making whatever adjustments that they could make to save their lives. Keep in mind that these men had been at the sea before, and unlike me and the Midwest and my limited knowledge of the ocean, these men had cut their teeth in fishing boats. They were seasoned. And if you go to the 4th chapter of Mark, where the story is told, we finally find out that these exhausted men turned to look for Jesus. And where was he? Do you remember where he was? He was intentionally sleeping. In fact, it tells us that he had crawled probably into the stern, which was a small cavern of the boat, one of the few places where he would be out of the weather, out of the elements. He'd taken and made a pillow. Maybe that pillow was from what they used for the anchor, so it couldn't have been that cushy pillow they advertise on TV that's supposed to change your life. I have one of those. It's a nice pillow, but it didn't change my life. But nevertheless, he's asleep, and you have to imagine at that time that the disciples looking out not only felt small and insignificant, but also their lives were in danger. And they looked for Jesus, and one reminded the other, he is sleeping. And they turned and they woke him up and they asked the question. You remember what the question was? Teacher, don't you care? Teacher, don't you care if we drowned? The same question. Small and insignificant. There's a God away up there, but don't you care? So have you ever looked in the mirror? Have you ever looked in the mirror and you're facing a tough day? You're facing the loss of a loved one for another day. You're drowning in debt. Your grown-up children see you as insignificant. You're not sure of your relationship with your spouse. Old age takes your dignity. And you look in the mirror, it's easy. It's easy to feel unimportant and small. Did you ever ask the same question when you look in the mirror that the disciples did many years ago? Teacher, do you care? Teacher, Lord, do you care? about me? I know that you are God, away up there, but do I matter? Do you care? Because somehow, sometimes, Christ seems to be sleeping through our storm. Do you ever feel that way when you look in the mirror, that Christ is asleep during your storm? Well, I want to share a promise with you. And it's not a promise I really thought about as much, but just think, what if during that time of reflection, when you're looking in the mirror, both literally and figuratively, and you're thinking, do you care? What if you thought about a verse that you have memorized probably since you were a child? So God created, remember? God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that goes across the ground. But I never really saw the promise that's embedded in those words. It's a great promise, but it's very easy to overlook. God made us to reflect his image. God created us to be more like him. Now think about it. Nowhere else do we read or are we taught of something else that is made in his own image. Inside of you is the essence of God, created in his own image. You see that ocean and those waves, as magnificent as they are, as powerful as they are when driven by the wind, are not created in God's image. The lion and the tiger, majestic creatures and powerful, but they are not made in God's image. You are. I am. And yet we think that we're small. We think that we're insignificant. We question if we have value. You and I contain the very essence and image of God. Now, to be clear, no one is God unless they're in their own delusion. But we and every one of us carry the characteristics of God. And when you think of the characteristics, what words come to mind? Love, kindness, mercy, compassion, eternity. See, those are the attributes that set you apart from the waves, the mountains, the pet goldfish. We are made in his image. We are made in his likeness, the Bible teaches us. And if you flip forward in Genesis to chapter 5, you find kind of the same wording. Adam had a son. Remember his son's name? Seth? Seth. And we see the same term again. He, Adam, had a son in his own image, and he named him Seth. Seth was not Adam, any more than my sons, Joshua and Shane, are me. But whether they like it or not, they have some likenesses. Some of them I'm sure they would like to hide rather than enhance. It used to be when my hair would fall out and they looked at me and they said, man, I sure hope I don't get bald like that. And I said, well, son, you have some of these same characteristics. And I remember when Joshua's voice kind of changed, and if you hear both of us on the telephone, although mine has gotten a little older over the last few years, sometimes it became difficult when people called the house to distinguish whether they were talking to Joshua or whether they were talking to me. And if you all think through your parents or your children, you could see some likeness there. You can see some essence, some mannerisms. The same is true of us. We were created in his image. We take after God. we take after God, and there is no exception to this promise. If you read that passage on created, it doesn't say he created some and not others. Every man and woman, born or preborn, rich or poor, educated or illiterate, living in the metropolitan areas or living in the rural areas, is made in God's image. Take a minute and let that re-soak in. Made in God's image. We're aware in our world today that some people enhance this image. We're also well aware in our world today that some people suppress this image. Many try to reject the image, but it is still true. Sin distorts and destroys this image, but it has not destroyed it. The image of God is sometimes very difficult to discern in our world today. You know, it's lost sometimes, tainted in moral impurity, polluted by foolish ideas. We have fallen prey to the idea of self-promotion instead of God promotion. But don't think for a minute, not a moment, that God has rescinded or changed the plan. He still creates people, all people, in His image and to bear His likeness and to display His glory. When you look in the mirror, you see God's image. You see God's likeness. The New Testament describes it. It's kind of a progressive work. And we recognize, just as you have had with children, how you try to shape that. You develop a relationship. So you understand that image. You worship Him, study Him, fellowship with His people as you are this morning, and obey His commandments. And as we seek to understand and reflect His character, something wonderful begins to happen. Well, let's not say something wonderful. Let's say someone wonderful. Someone wonderful. Someone valuable. Someone significant begins to emerge. The caterpillar to the butterfly, as we reflect God's character and God's glory. I noticed when I was out on the beach, there were people walking around that had headsets on, and they were scouring the beach with their metal detectors. I thought, I wonder if that's a hobby or if you can actually get rich doing that. So I was watching, thinking, maybe I should invest in a metal detector, you know? So I'm watching, and there's several of them just walking up and down the beach, swinging their metal. It's probably like their morning walk, I don't know, swinging their metal detector. And every once in a while, it must ding, and they would reach down, and they'd take a little trowel out of their back if they needed it, and they'd scoot down, and they'd bring something out. You know what it usually was as I watched them? It's usually a penny or a dime. Somebody dropped a little bit of money there. But then when they picked it up, the first thing they would do is they'd rub their hands on it. And they'd try to get rid of the smudge. They'd try to get rid of the smudge. And as they got rid of the smudge, what emerges? If you get rid of the smudge on a penny, what do you see? You see a face. I think it's Abraham Lincoln's, but I don't want to sound foolish. If you remove a dime, it's a Roosevelt, right? On a dime? Been so long since a penny or a dime has had enough value that I can't read. But anyway, as you rub that smudge off, a face begins to emerge. The face was always there, but it was only when the smudge was removed that you began to see the face. That image is there in all of us. But many of us are just so buried in the sand that we don't allow the Maker to rub away the smudge. We don't allow the Creator to get rid of the dirt and let that image appear. That characteristic that's there appear. Because you see, God's goal is to take you who were created in His image, you who were created in His likeness, and rub away the ungodly, so that that inborn image can be seen and God comes out. How does He come out? He comes out in our worship. He comes out in the words we say, the kindness that we show, the acts that we do. And Paul looked at that a lot, and I never really thought about some of the words of Paul, but if you look at Colossians 3, 9 and 10, he says, do not lie to each other. That seems pretty reasonable, right? Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge, in the image of its Creator. Creator's there. That image is there. But with study, with worship, with knowledge, with relationship, we begin to see that image. And then he goes on in 2 Corinthians 3:18, and we who were unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory and are being transformed into his likeness, with ever-increasing glory which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. Let me read that to you again and think about it now. And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory and are being transformed into his likeness, with ever-increasing glory which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. No value? Small? Insignificant? And yet the Lord tells me in Paul tells me in 2 Corinthians 3:18 that I am being transformed into the likeness of the one who created those waves. I am being transformed into his likeness, because you see, pop psychology is wrong when it tells you you need to look inside yourself to achieve value. Because when I don't recognize the essence and the likeness of God that is inside myself, and I look inside and I'm realistic, I don't see much value sometimes. The magazine and the TV, they're wrong when they suggest you are only as good as you are thin. I'd love to be thinner, but I'm not disciplined enough. I haven't come to a crisis yet, so I haven't chosen to be thinner. But you see, magazines and TVs are wrong when they say you're only as good as you are thin. You're only as good if you're pimple-free. You're only as good as... It's wrong. The movies mislead us when they imply that our value only increases in direct proportion to our monetary net worth. It's wrong. Pastors and spiritual leaders, when they tell you how to measure your spiritual value by whether or not you're in service, how blessed you are, how many Sunday school classes you've taught, how many acts of kindness, they're wrong. Now, don't misunderstand me. I didn't say you shouldn't do acts of kindness, and I didn't say you shouldn't come to church. But I'm saying your value is not based on those acts. According to the Bible, right at the very beginning in Genesis, we are told, you are important. You are significant because God created you, period. Did you ever think about that? You are significant and you are important because God created you, period. Wow. He cherishes you because you are in his likeness. And his challenge in your life is simply to allow him to rub off the smudges so that the image appears. Allow him to do the work he longs to do to shape you. I read a story about a church service, medieval times, and the priest invited everyone to come. And as they came in, it was total darkness. They couldn't see hardly to take their place, but finally they took their seats, and still total darkness, and the priest wasn't at the front. And then after a little time, the priest walked in, and he lit a candle, and he held the candle at the bottom of the crucifix, and there was only enough illumination to see the feet of Christ and to see the wounds that were left for you. And then he backed up just a little bit, and there was a little bit more illumination. And you could begin to see up the body, and you could begin to see where the blood was running down from the sides. And the priest stepped back a little bit more, and you could see eventually the tear in Christ's eye. And Then you could see the crown of thorns. And then the hands as he stepped by, and there was just enough illumination that they began to see the cross. Then the light went out, and the service was over. What if that's our assignment? To let our light and lives shine so that they shed light on Christ. So that they can look at us and they can see the image. They can see the essence of God if they look nowhere else, because it's in us and we have allowed it to flourish. Let me invite you to do something. Would you let this truth fill your heart this week? Just let this truth fill your heart this week, because you see, you were conceived by God. You were conceived by God before you were conceived by your parents. You were loved by God before you were ever loved by another person. You're not here today because there was an accident. You're not a fluke. You're not a consequence of evolution. You're not defined by the number of followers you have on Twitter. That was sort of a joke. Kind of loosened up the moment. You're not defined by the dollars in your bank account, the health of your body, the car you drive, CEO or unemployed, it doesn't matter. Hot list or no list, it doesn't matter. Blue blood or orphan, it doesn't matter. First string or bench warmer, it doesn't matter. You are valuable because you were created in His image and you are being transformed in His likeness. You are significant. Put that on a resume. You are a diamond. You are a rose purchased by the very blood of Christ. Because you see, you and me, we, those who aren't here today, everyone created, we are God's masterpiece. I'm a masterpiece. You're a masterpiece. And yet we look in the mirror and we have trouble seeing the value. We see ourselves as small. I challenge you today to recognize that He has created anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do good things that He planned a long time ago. Because you see, in the eyes of God, and we forget sometimes, in the eyes of God, you are worth dying for. The one who created the waves, the tigers and the lions, said, Joseph Shetler, you are worth dying for. How much more value can the TV and the movie and the popular culture give me when I know that the God who created heaven and earth recognized that I and you have enough value to die for? Tell that to the person who looks back at you in the mirror and says you're small and says you're insignificant. Let that soak in. I was created by God and am designed to be transformed into His likeness. What would happen if we let this same truth, what would happen if we let this same truth that gives us value, what would happen if we use that to define the other people that we see? Because you see, God didn't just create Joseph Shetler. If you read that, He created all. Whether enhancing or suppressing the truth, we are all made in God's image. And Paul tells us that one man, Christ, died for everyone. He puts us all in the same boat. Christ included everyone in His death so that everyone could be included in His life, a resurrected life. What if we chose to not evaluate people by what they have or how they look or what we think they deserve? What if we recognize that every person was created by God and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect? What would that change what we do on Monday or Tuesday? I don't know about those Sooners. Sometimes that's difficult when they stroll in on Monday to talk to me about their recent victory. But nevertheless, all people deserve to be seen by who they were intended to be, the image bearers of God. You know, I have been involved in Bruce Bonfleur's ministry for 14, 15 years, I suppose. He used to be my racquetball partner, and we would play racquetball in Chadron, and then we'd have supper and then spend some time. And if you don't know, he has a ministry in White Clay. And I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, we stood at the main street of White Clay, and he looked at me, and he said, you know, Joe, someday God has told me that his light is going to shine in this place. And I looked there and I couldn't see it. I mean, I love Bruce to death, but I've got people urinating, and throwing on the floor. It's not there, Bruce. I don't know who's talking to you, but something, you got the wrong signal, bud. You know, it isn't here. And I know, I lived in Sharon County for 25 years. I know the political aspects of the issue, and that's not my point. But my point is, when I was there on Friday, I saw a new Family Dollar that's being created. I saw a new nursing home where 30 people are staying. I felt safe walking up and down the streets. Driving through, I was always worried I was going to hit somebody. Several people came in to do work. He has in mind a vision to create a trade store where people that can't afford to for some of the tools that are required for some of that can come in and do that. And you know what? I kind of believe him now. Because there has been a transformation. And I remember standing there, and he would look at people that were obviously intoxicated to the point they could hardly stand up. And he would say to me, those are God's children. Those are just fallen warriors at the moment. God is going to rise them up. And I thought, Bruce, you can't look at people like that. You need a dose of reality here of what's really going on. But somehow, God gave him the ability to recognize the value in people in that aspect. Because you see, we live in a hostile, trigger-happy society. And if you don't believe me, turn on the TV. People even select the channels of news that they'll watch based on how that's going to be presented. Look at Facebook sometimes and read certain articles and aspects and comments that people are willing to make on Facebook. We live in a society that I think is losing its ability to have an honest disagreement with one another. Because most of what you see is disrespect, arrogance, and mean-spiritedness. It's kind of become the theme of our culture today. And you can say, well, he's not real. God hasn't talked to him. But I believe in my heart of hearts that our society is still looking for a quorum group of people who believe what God teaches. Who believe that people have intrinsic value because they were created by God, designed to develop and progress in his likeness and his essence. Every person is valuable. Not just the people who agree with me. Every person is valuable. Those who care for the one who disagrees with me, God cares for the one who disagrees with me as much as he cares for me. He cares for the person who has political views that are different than mine just as much as he cares for me. What if I was the person, what if you were the person this week that said, regardless of the disagreements that happen every day, what if I refused to put people in a pigeonhole? And I looked at them recognizing the intrinsic value that they have because God created them. Because you see, the person who sits next to you at school was created in God's image. The person who offended you this week was created in God's image. The person who was rude to you this week, last week, was still created in God's image. You see, they are human beings. They are human beings with so much value that the same Christ that died for me died for them. Can you imagine the impact that this promise would have on a society that actually believed it? And it has to start maybe with one person, maybe with two. What impact would that have? And I remember years ago when we only had 3 news stations. I think they were ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS if you adjusted your rabbit ears just right. There's some of you that know what I'm talking about, okay? There are others that this is, with cable and digital have no clue. But there were a time when you had rabbit ears that you had to move, and then somebody sometimes had to go outside and rotate the antenna on top of the roof to pick up the particular station that you wanted to see. Well, one night on the news, I was watching the news with my father. I can't remember how old I was, but I was riveted to the screen, black and white screen, because a plane taking off, I don't know if it was what this airport was called at that time, but to see a plane taking off in New York had hit the 4th Street Bridge. It had hit the 4th Street Bridge. And it was in February. And that plane plummeted into the Potomac. And I'm going to tell you about a man. There's no statue in all of Washington, D.C., where there's all those statues of all those important people. There's no statue to this person. If I told you his name, you wouldn't even know it. But for some reason, that day, when that plane hit the icy Potomac, 6 people survived. And they got out onto the side, and they were holding on to the fuselage, and the helicopter came whirring in. It was live. I'm not sure, it must not have been live TV, but anyway, as we watched, the helicopter came whirling in, and the ladder went down. The ladder went down, and a man grabbed the ladder. He had life in his hands, and he grabbed the ladder, and he handed it to the person next to him, and he started him up the ladder. That person next to him wasn't his mother. It wasn't his sister. It was a stranger. It was a stranger. And he handed the ladder to them. And off they went, holding on to safety. And the helicopter came back and whirred again, and it dropped the ladder into the same man's hands. He had life in his hands. In the icy Potomac, and he handed the ladder to a stranger. And we watched as this scene repeated itself 4 times. 4 times. He had life in his hands. And he handed it to a stranger. He didn't ask them who they voted for. He didn't ask them whether they were male or female or what the color of their skin was. He handed it to them in the icy Potomacs in February. And it came back again, a 5th time. The helicopter came back. And he grabbed the lifeline, and he did not have the strength. He did not have the strength to climb up the ladder. His hypothermia had set in, and he sunk to the bottom. And he was gone. His name is Arlen Williams. Probably doesn't ring a bell with any of you. But I can't imagine every year at Thanksgivings, there's not some families that remember his name. Because he handed that lifeline to a stranger. He placed so much value in that person next to him that he gave it away. What kind of an impact would that have in our society if we actually believed that the person next to us had that kind of value? Can you imagine the impact that this would have if we believed every single person within our boundaries was shaped by God, created by God, and asked to live their life in the image of God? What kindness would that foster? How would that change what I do this week? Because you see, the fire of feuds would have no fuel if we believed even those who disagreed with us maybe had a good idea. Will a boss neglect an employee? Not if she believes every human has value and deserves to be heard and respected. Will society write off the indigent, the drunk, the mentally ill, the preborn, the refugee, the inmate. It's easy to write off people that we don't believe have value. Not if we believe every human is God's idea, and God has no bad ideas. How would that change as we look at people? Think back to our fishermen. What happened to our fishermen on the Sea of Galilee in the middle of that storm? Did God care? Did the Savior sleep through and let them perish? Were they not valuable enough to disturb his nap? Because each one of those men was created in God's image. Listen to me, Christ is not sleeping through your storm. Christ is not sleeping through your financial storm, your loss, your pain, even your death. Christ is not sleeping because you have value. You were created in God's image with his essence. Take that to heart. God valued you. God values them. God values us. Christ will calm your storm just in ways that he calmed theirs. You know, Shane is going to have his, Shane's not going to, but anyway, Shane and his wife, Aubrey, are going to have my third grandson, second one of theirs, is going to come in 2 or 3 weeks. You know, I love that little boy. And I've never even seen him. He hasn't ever brought me a cup of coffee. He's never called me Papa. He's never done anything for me. And I love him. And what if he's not perfect? What if he's got 4 fingers instead of 5? You know what? I will love him anyway. Why is that? Because he's got a tiny part of me in there. There's a little essence, might be a little teeny part, but there's a little essence, there's a little likeness of me in there. And I have never even met him. But somehow something about me's there. There's a little likeness. And if my son was to call and say, Dad, we need your heart in order for him to live, I'd give it. Many of you would do the same. Because of the likeness. Well, you see, every person without exception is valuable in the eyes of our blessed Creator. God loves you with an inexpressible, undistinguishable love. Why? Same reason that I think about that little grandson that's not even born, that I already love. Why? Not because of what you've done, but because of because of whose you are. You were made in the image of God. Someone calls you a failure. They're wrong. Someone wrote you off as a lost cause. They're wrong. Someone told you you have outsinned the love of God. They're wrong. Someone told you you're not worthy of God's love. Let them take that lie back to hell where it belongs. Because everything you read and everything you know, you are worthy of God's love. The truth of the matter is you were made by God, loved by God, and that promise has not rescinded, and that plan has not changed. So when you look in the mirror and you see gray hairs and you see pimples and you see things that you think, and there's not any value here. And you look in the bank account and it's not as big as somebody else's, then their value goes down. And you look at a relationship that's caused problems and this and that, and the value goes down. Remember, when you look in the mirror, you'll see the likeness of God. And he said, you are worth dying for. So this week, I'd like you to keep just 2 things in mind. It's real simple. And you knew them already before I started talking. I just want to refresh them. Number 1, you are worth dying for, and that by the Creator, the one who hung the stars and created the waves, said you are worth dying for. That gives you value. no matter what the world says, that gives you value. And second of all, I would like you to remember that that same value exists for your neighbor, even the one you don't like, even the one you disagree with. God said they're valuable too. They are my children too. We, people, are children of God, and you have value.